Mute. Oh, good morning, Roman. Can you hear me? Excellent. Excellent.
And I am just going to, having unmuted myself, I'm about to close the door where I am and focus entirely on you guys.
Thank you, sir.
Here we are. So, greetings to all of you on the West Coast.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining in, Roman. It's greatly appreciated. We have an interesting hybrid today where we've got an in-person audience here in Prince George, plus an online audience from other CIC branches across the country. So hopefully the technical issues have all been resolved and this runs smoothly. But we're really excited to have you here today.
Great, well, thank you very much. And as you can see from the flags behind me, I'm in an office in Poland. You'll see the Polish flag, the EU flag. I'm at the office of the Polish Ombudsman for Small and Medium Enterprises, who are kindly hosting us while we cope with the odd invasion of Ukraine. And my team is in my current job, and that job is Business Ombudsman of Ukraine, is spread now across different parts of Ukraine, mostly the West, but also some fighting in the army in the Kyiv area, and then across a range of European countries. We've set up a temporary, if you will, office in exile in Poland, in Krakow. I'm in Warsaw right now, but as part of the network of the Polish Ombudsman. And we have tried to continue to support business, both Ukrainian business and business across borders, which is because the Polish-Ukrainian border is now a lifeline for Ukraine. So that's why I am where I am. And I think, but I'll let you guys do the appropriate intros and then launch into the main topic.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to start, I guess, turn to the audience here. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to introduce or welcome you to our breakfast talk with Canada's former Ukrainian ambassador, Roman Waschuk. To talk about the war in Ukraine and the global responses. My name is Sean Timmons. I'm president of the Canadian International Council Prince George branch, a non-profit, non-partisan organization dedicated to international issues from a Canadian perspective. Now, a couple of housekeeping things today. What we'll do is we'll set up Roman to give an introductory talk, and then we'll have some online questions as well as questions in the audience. And so we'll try and manage the questions online. Got my wife Kathy Bueller here to manage the online questions. So if anyone has any questions online, please add them into the Q&A box. And in the audience here, raise your hand, and we'll try to alternate back and forth as we're going through this. So without further ado, let me introduce the speaker. Roman Waschuk served as Canada's ambassador to Ukraine from 2014 to 2019, capping over 3 decades with Canada's diplomatic service. The son of Ukrainian immigrants that came to Canada after the Second World War, he was born in Toronto and later graduated from the University of Toronto, earning a bachelor and master's degree in Central and Eastern European history. In 1987, he joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade and worked in the Eastern European Union policy planning divisions. Abroad, he served in political and economic sections of Canada's embassies in Moscow, Kyiv, and Berlin, and in 2011 was appointed Ambassador of Canada to Serbia with concurrent accreditation to Northern Macedonia and Montenegro, and then served as Canada's ambassador to Kyiv from October 2014 until October 2019. Today, he is Business Ombudsman for the Business Ombudsman Council in Ukraine, an organization dedicated to combating corruption. Welcome, Roman.
Well, thank you very much. And that reminder of my own past brings thoughts. When you grow up in a family of people who've been displaced, and my parents came as DPs, displaced persons, to Canada between 1948 and 1950, both on my father's and on my mother's side, you hear a lot of stories. And when you're growing up in Canada in relatively calm, stable circumstances, you listen to those stories and you think, yeah, they're good stories, but maybe they're laying it on a bit thick in terms of how bad people can get and how cruel and how sort of the brutality of war and of oppression can be. Then you go to university, as I did, and you learn about reflecting on different narratives and the fact that nothing is quite as straightforward as it might seem. There are many analytical approaches to things. Footnote all these thoughts, look up differing sources, etc. Then you join the diplomatic corps, and in diplomacy, being empathetic, understanding the motivation not only of friends but of enemies is very important. And so you sort of make a career of nuance and of trying to see the other side of things. Well, the unfortunate news I have for you is that the events of the past month and a half with the Russian attack on Ukraine actually mean that my grandparents were right. All the relativist nuance that I've managed to pick up in the interim has been disproven by the actions of the current Russian army, which seems to have imbibed the worst traditions of the Red Army, the NKVD, and borrowed a few tricks from the Nazi Germans while they were at it. So you're seeing a post-career, slightly chastened me who's questioning some of my own questioning of my forefathers' narratives as I'm seeing them in this kind of very disturbing way come back to life in that which is happening to and around Ukraine right now. What we're seeing is the result of what I describe as two vectors. One is Russia/Soviet Union as the power that was defeated essentially, or suffered a defeat in the Cold War, and therefore, first of all, had to retreat from its forward positions in Eastern Europe, starting with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the whole series of events, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the return of solidarity after martial law in Poland in 1989, 1990, until the wave hit the Soviet Union itself, and that's in the Western borderlands, the Baltics, the reassertion of independence by the Baltics, and then the beginnings of pro-democracy movements in then Soviet republics like Ukraine, but also in Moscow itself. What Russians no longer recall, but I do because I was in Moscow from 1988 to 1991, is that Moscow, the Moscow intelligentsia, the policies, those of you who may recall, of perestroika and glasnost, were among the main drivers of change. These were picked up elsewhere within the Soviet Empire, and people ran with them in their own ways. But the big changes were instigated in Moscow by people who were part of the central Soviet apparatus. As a result, though, unexpectedly for the people who had started the changes in Moscow, they resulted in the Soviet Union itself falling apart, and the constituent republics proclaiming independence in 1991, and then a difficult period for all these countries, but for Russia itself, which meant that in Russia, democracy began to be seen as something that brings with it dislocation, impoverishment, and a sense of humiliation, a sense that we used to be somebody, people used to be afraid of us. Now we have to ask other people for help, and we feel we're poor compared to others, poor and disrespected. Other parts of the former Soviet Union spent that time more or less successfully organizing their lives as best they saw fit. But you had in Russia, after the Yeltsin presidency, the transfer of power to Vladimir Putin, a former intelligence operative, KGB officer who had worked ironically in East Germany, in Dresden, as a KGB resident, for whom the fall of the Soviet Union was, as he's repeatedly put it, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And as we know, he had decided then, and is working on it now, that he needs to reverse that trend. After 20 years in power, he's accumulated the resources, and he has squashed Russian political opposition and mastered the political system in a way that he feels he can rule unopposed and make reckless decisions unopposed. So part of what we're seeing is this idea that Russia, the great power, needs to return to its normal, according to certainly Putin and many Russians, fairly dominant position in the eastern end of Europe, and with either a zone of influence, veto power, over a range of countries that lie to the west of it, some of whom have in the interim joined NATO. You could see the official Russian approach to that in the draft treaties which were submitted to both individual countries and to NATO as an organization and to the OSCE in mid-December of last year. The motto there was roll back NATO to where it was in 1997. Russia gets a co-determining voice on anything significant in European security, not just broadly, but specifically in terms of its neighboring countries, and the like. And again, that's an unpleasant sort of draft document to receive, but it's not entirely strange given the way great powers behave. If that were the only driver of Russian behavior, and they pretended for a while it was, we're upset about Ukraine potentially joining NATO, we worry a lot about NATO, we think it may have aggressive intent, then that would have been manageable from a policy point of view. And it's the way that the US and a range of key allies, and that actually also includes France and Germany, President Macron and Chancellor Scholz, tried to manage it, saying, here you've got some, you've put forward some proposals, we don't accept them the way you formulated, but we have some options for how we could engage in technical discussions on disarmament, where we place missiles, how some of these international mechanisms could maybe better be organized to achieve sort of common security interests. So that's the one vector. The other vector is Vladimir Putin's increasing neo-imperialist obsession with Ukraine. When people say, as they often do, he wants to put the Soviet Union back together again, that's not really where he's at anymore. Yes, he complained about it falling apart, but his own personal historical analysis is that it fell apart because it was too liberal. It was too nice to constituent nationalities, because the real way of approaching it is the way things were done in the final years of the Tsarist Empire. You proclaim autocracy, you proclaim one single Russian nationality, and you proclaim orthodoxy as the dominant faith. And so both in his historical article about Ukraine of last year and in his speeches just before he launched his war, which was sort of a declaration of war, he railed against the Bolsheviks, he railed against Lenin, saying, these people gave people like Ukrainians too many rights. They recognize their existence. That's so wrong. These people don't exist at all. They're just Russians. They're Russians who have been bamboozled and deluded into thinking that there's somebody else, and they've been bamboozled by enemies of Russia, whether those are Poles, Austro-Hungarians, Nazi Germans, soft European liberal technocrats, or Washington policymakers. Basically, evil, bad, nasty outsiders. And it is my mission as president and the mission of the armed forces of whom I'm commander-in-chief to fix all that. And we're going to fix it very directly by attacking this country, Ukraine. And as we're now discovering from their new rhetoric, wiping its identity and a portion of its people from the face of the earth. There was that article that appeared, I think, 3 days ago on the Russian official news agency, RIA Novosti, talking about what we need to do with Ukraine. And the answer was its elite is irredeemable. They simply need to be found and shot. Some others are difficult to deal with, so they need to be sent to forced labor, and others need to be simply repressed and squashed until they realize the error of their ways. That is not a recipe for democratic development of any society. It is, in fact, a recipe for genocide, not in the sense of killing everyone from a given nationality, but wiping out its identity by eliminating elites and by eliminating key professional groups within that population. That's basically what the Russians are up to now. They are calling it denazification. And again, it's because they believe that a different identity could only have been brought by descendants of the Nazis. They are not stopped by seeming logical contradictions, such as the president of Ukraine being a person of Jewish background who was democratically elected by 73% of the population and defeating the previous incumbent, which is, again, something unimaginable in today's Russia. But none of that gets in the way of a very seamless, internally coherent, generally coherent Russian propaganda narrative that seems to have persuaded 3/4 or more of the Russian people that they're onto a good thing with this war. Now, they may change their minds when they see more body bags coming back, but again, they're trying to ensure that the body bags don't come back. One of the unfortunate things that was discovered, in addition to civilian casualties, after their forced retreat from around northeast Kyiv, is that they didn't pick up their own casualties. They simply left them lying there for weeks because there was no desire to return these fallen soldiers to families, because it would have raised many, many questions that they do not wish to see spreading within the Russian populace. So that's how we've come to where we are today. Russia is a highly vertically governed state. I mean, as authoritarian, verging on totalitarian countries are. Ukraine, and I know this from having been ambassador there and now trying to exercise the business ombudsman function, is an extremely horizontal state. What that means is that until recently, it was generally seen as somewhat dysfunctional. Because there was always a need to get some sort of consensus. Western countries wanted to see rapid reform. Rapid reform meant somebody telling other people what to do. Ukrainians don't like being told what to do. So inevitably, the quick and sharp reforms that people like us wanted to see were then watered down or implemented slowly. And we would say, these guys can't organize a piss up in a brewery. What's wrong with these people? They aren't with the program. The IMF was frustrated. The World Bank was frustrated. But beyond all of that frustration, Ukrainians were getting on with their lives, and sometimes working not necessarily against the state, but in parallel with the state, were forming companies, were, for example, developing a burgeoning IT sector that was all based on a tax loophole of individual entrepreneurship, but ultimately has grew to just before the war, over 200,000 software engineers in the country and hundreds of companies active also internationally. So there was a disconnect between what was the overall narrative that this country couldn't get its act together and what I could see when I was living there for 5 years as ambassador and then came back in January, February, that a lot of things actually worked in their own way, but they worked. And so the result of this is that you had this huge monolith, Russia vertically governed, threatening Ukraine and then launching a war against Ukraine. And you had the hard power military analysts who crunched the numbers and said, one side has 10 times more tanks than the other, it has 20 times more planes, it's got the other side has way more rockets. And the conclusion was the Ukrainians are going to get crushed in about 2 or 3 days. It's all going to be very sad. And then the most we need to worry about is whether we airdrop them some supplies for a partisan war, which they'll have to run on behalf of their government in exile. That's not the way it turned out, though. Although the hard power analysts were right about Russia launching the war, they didn't factor in the fact that Russia, despite appearing to be a monolith, has a military which reflects its society. And that is a society that is rotten within. So therefore, it could put on fantastic May 9th victory parades, but that army doesn't perform in the field and it doesn't think for itself. So when somebody is sent it down a road, none of the low-ranking officers will think for themselves. They will just keep traveling until they get picked off.
Got it. Okay. Now, what else need to do is figure out. Oh, awesome. Okay. I think we're back, Roman. Can you?
Yep. That was probably a hint that I was going on for too long.
I'll let you continue, and I'll send an email out to everyone that's online so that the old people can, or the people that were on the previous call can join this one as well. So
right.
I'll let you continue to the Prince George audience. Thanks.
All right. So I will just quickly wrap up here while I still can. So I think one of the last thoughts I was expressing was about the Russian army being sort of rotten in the sense that it wasn't performing the way it should. It isn't performing the way it should have, and that it has very little capacity for autonomous thinking. So one of the things that happens is that, and you saw this in these, the 60-kilometer long supply chain snaking down towards Kyiv from the northwest, and some of the other road-based thrusts the Russians did, is that they simply kept going regardless of what was happening around them. And so they got picked off by much more mobile, smaller groups of Ukrainians using their Western supplied weapons, the NLAWs from the UK, javelins from the US, and maybe even in some cases, some of the Carl Gustavs, which they've gotten from the Canadian Armed Forces. What happened, and on the Ukrainian side, of course, Ukraine has a considerably smaller army on paper, but it has been changing the way it thinks for the last 7 or 8 years. It, of course, has been at war against a kind of miniature version of the Russian army in Donbass for the last 8 years, and it has been trained by some of the better performers in the Western world. And that includes, I would say, first and foremost, the Canadian Armed Forces, Operation Unifier, your tax dollars at work there, the UK through Operation Orbital, and the US through its training programs as well. A lot of people were skeptical, as people are both in Ukraine and around Ukraine, saying, is that training doing any good? We can see now that actually that training not only worked, it was internalized by the Ukrainians. And so Ukrainian units are working autonomously, non-commissioned officers, people lower down the ranks are thinking for themselves. They're getting general orders, right arc, left arc, and do what it takes to get the job done. And that's what they're doing. And in many cases, the Russians were done before they managed to achieve their goals. What we see now is that far from collapsing within 3 days, Ukraine is now well into month 2 of the war. The Russians, who had very ambitious plans for air assaults on the Kyiv area and taking over the capital within hours, if not days, were essentially destroyed in those attempts. In terms of their attempts to take over Ukrainian airfields, they did a late-breaking reenactment of a bridge too far, in this case, 2 airfields too far. And although they did ultimately get their tanks down not too far from Kyiv, the logistics broke down. They were unable to keep advancing. They chose to cut their losses and retreat from around the capital before ultimately they were encircled by the Ukrainians and done in on the gates of Kyiv. Now, they never expected to retreat. They're saying now, of course, we never, what Kyiv? Where it was just a feint, a huge feint. And our real goal is Donbass, always was. But, judging by the resources they committed at the outset and by the way they behaved, including the terror against the civilian population, which we've seen, they were never expecting to evacuate and abandon those cities. Otherwise, they would not have left behind the evidence and the mess and the sort of evil that we have discovered over the past week. Now the Ukrainians are reorganizing themselves to face the new Russian focus on the east. It'll be interesting to see. Obviously, the Ukrainians are very concerned, and they are communicating that concern to outsiders. It will be interesting to see if Russian units can be regenerated and remotivated after being as badly mauled as they were in the north of Ukraine. Yes, you can move them by rail. Will they be any better, more effective, attacking from the east than they were attacking from the north? Okay, fewer woods, fewer swamps, certain things may be easier, but I would say the Ukrainians still have quite a good chance of winning it in terms of their ground game, where of course they are underpowered, and we've been hearing this for a month, is in the air. Again, the Russians were expected by everyone, including themselves, to assert total air superiority after the first night of the attack, where they were supposed to have taken out both the Ukrainian Air Force and all Ukrainian air defenses, but the Ukrainian Air Force continues to fly. And again, it's only got about 50 planes, to the Russians, hundreds. And Ukrainian, basically Soviet-era air defense continues to knock down not every missile launched at Ukraine, but a significant proportion. So Ukraine is very much still in this fight. It is getting more support, but maybe not as much and as quickly as it needs to. I would say what you would need to get through the Russians' current propaganda haze is some sort of humiliating defeat on the ground, where thousands of Russian soldiers would be forced to surrender. Only that would send a message to Russia that would force Putin to negotiate, not just pro forma, as they have been in Istanbul, but actually genuinely agree to something that would allow Ukraine to live its life. And Russia, if not to save face, because that's going to be kind of hard after all they've been up to, but at least to withdraw and to not inflict more suffering on its own troops and ultimately on parents across the Russian Federation, who otherwise are going to lose more and more of their children to the maw of this war. So that's kind of where we stand, I think, at the moment. And I'd be happy to take your questions, whether live from Prince George or from somewhere else online. in this discussion.
Yes, thank you, Roman. Just trying to deal with some of the technical issues now. We seem to have lost our online audience, but we have our audience still here at Prince George. So maybe what I'll do is start with, yes, Charles.
President Zelensky had a video series pre his presidency called Servant of the People that's now playing on Netflix. To what degree does it describe the frustration with government corruption in the 2016 era? To what degree is that an accurate portrayal of the frustrations that the Ukrainians had with an ineffective government? To what degree did it set the stage for the kind of transformation that pretty obviously has happened?
Right. I think it accurately reflects it. And this is a strong internal narrative that the Ukrainians had. And of course, it was reflected in the outside view of the country as well. Zelensky and many of the people who are in his core of his presidential administration are basically a comedy crew. And if you can think of sort of the RMR report turning into Canada's PMO, or this hour has 22 minutes governance. That's kind of what happened. And I'd have to admit that in late January, early February, as I saw the clouds gathering, I had major concerns about whether this particular governing group would be up to the task of dealing with, a major global scale invasion. And my concerns were misplaced. They rose to the occasion. Cometh the hour, cometh the man, but also a number of the people around him. And they have kept going. The benefit of having someone with a media background is, of course, that he has been messaging very effectively both to Ukrainians and to international audiences, adapting the the message, the pitch, if you will, to various parliaments, various audiences where they've been doing it. Now, what's interesting, and again, in my business ombudsman guys, I've dealt a lot with compliance, and Ukrainians are not a naturally very compliant people. You sort of think of Ukraine, think of it as a sort of Slavic Italy, where people can be quite entrepreneurial, but they sort of don't trust people in government. And again, if you watch Servant of the People, you can partly see why, and partly see how it's not complying is almost heroic, given how critically people feel about government. But what's happened is that tax minimizing businesses, when they realize that the alternative to this occasionally slightly wonky Ukrainian state is a authoritarian / totalitarian Russian state, which wants to not just assimilate them, but dominate them and tell them what to do on a daily basis, they have voluntarily ponied up money to the state to prop it up. The National Bank opened an account. The account, I think, has collected 14 billion hryvnia from people and companies. That is close to $600 million in donations. The Ukrainian budget, despite the fact that obviously economic activity took a huge hit in the month of March, tax revenues were at 93% of planned levels. So it means that people were sometimes paying in advance their taxes to support the state, where they saw it obviously profoundly threatened by this invasion. So Zelensky's everyday, every guy image helps create that emotional bond between the governors and the governed. And in that respect, it's been effective. They've even done massive tax reform over the last couple of weeks. So I guess people who had been lobbying for simplifying taxes before broke through in crisis. So now, for example, for small business, paying Ukraine's VAT, which is like a harmonized sales tax, has become voluntary. You can instead pay a 2% turnover tax. We'll see how that all works out in practice, and we'll see if once the war ends, the tax authority won't try to grab some of that back. That's certainly what a lot of my legal beagle employees are afraid of. But for the moment, the government has been doing the right thing to build business confidence and to maintain that sense of solidarity between governors and governed.
All right, thank you, Roman. Go on, good question.
So you've lived in Ukraine, you've lived in Russia, you've studied the politics and the lives of these countries for years. Where does this all end? I mean, how does this war resolve itself? Does Russia just walk away with its tail between its legs, or Ukraine going to invade Russia and take it over, which would be a good thing? I personally like Zelensky. Where does this end? How do you see this?
Right. So this is the toughest question at the moment. I think Russia has tried quick wars to solve political problems before. The Russo-Japanese War was an example where the Tsar, in many respects, a bit of a Putin role model, felt that you could easily pick on Japan, kick it around, make Russia one of the great imperial nations along with its peers like the UK and France. That didn't work. The Japanese mauled the Russians, especially in naval terms. So one of the possible endings is a bit like that, where despite having planned a quick war to burnish Russia's and restore Russia's status as an imperial power and as a European gendarme, sort of a decision maker, you end up discovering that you can't do it, and that you are a bit, you find some formulation that doesn't quite say tail between legs, but you say, well, we'll keep the bits of Ukraine that we occupied prior to the 24th. They will be better protected than they were before, in Crimea as well. But otherwise, let's just go back to the status quo ante. Now but I think for Putin and the stability regime, that is really bad news. That will be seen as failure. The alternative is him believing that he cannot fail, and that if conventional means result in failure, then you need to escalate beyond conventional. That's when it gets hairy, either in chemical terms or even more so in nuclear terms. Should they decide to use tactical nuclear weapons, that's when, certainly in terms of US involvement, all bets are off. We've had a very conflict averse US administration. It really has other fish to fry. It had intended to park Russia while it dealt with China. Russia refused to be parked. In fact, it found it rather insulting to be parked. But it's been very clear as to what it would not do. It makes Ukrainians frustrated because they feel that's a bit of a license for them to get beaten up, while the administration makes clear that it does not intend to intervene in this conflict. But as soon as we reach possibly the chemical, but certainly even the tactical nuclear threshold, bets are off. That then becomes very hairy for all of us. So can Russia survive defeat without Putin opting for some form of weapons of mass destruction escalation. I guess that's the key decision point here.
All right, thanks. Actually, I've got a question. Roman, you were appeared on CBC Power and Politics last week with Vashi Kapelas, and a term you used to describe the current situation of weapons in Ukraine was palliative care. And that really caught my attention. And I was, as I understand it, it's that we will provide enough weapons so they won't fail, but not enough weapons for them to truly succeed, which creates sort of this long-term extended war of attrition. And I'm wondering if you can give me a sense of, where the nations of the West stand, which ones are stepping up to provide weapons, who are the laggards, and do you see a path through to get the Ukrainians enough weapons to succeed?
Yep. Well, we're seeing some countries now moving to that next phase. The Czech Republic, as of yesterday, started shipping tanks, T-72s, upgraded former Soviet tanks to Ukraine. These are the sorts of things you can use to launch counterattacks and retake territory. I think you might want to follow today's budget announcements in Canada to see whether Canada may be upping its game in terms of commitments to arm Ukraine. I think the US has been maybe the most publicly ambivalent, where they'll say airplanes, no, maybe not airplanes, or well, we were thinking tanks, but then tanks are kind of offensive, so we don't know. Or I think maybe in some cases having too much of a defense establishment, having too many people able to think for too long, gets you into analysis paralysis. Who have been genuinely leaders here since the weeks leading up to the outbreak of war have been the UK. Now, there's probably political reasons for that. There are noble political reasons, one of which is that post-Brexit, the UK is looking for a sort of signature European security role, and being a leader in providing arms to Ukraine is such a role. And in Ben Wallace, the Minister of Defense, they have a very articulate defense minister who is able to both deliver very convincing speeches on the subject and ensure that his own department, as was the case with the anti-tank weapons, the NLAWs, that the airplanes with the first shipments took off from an RAF base while he was speaking in the House of Commons. So you have complete synchronization between word and deed. And the UK have also now been among the first to provide sort of land to sea missiles, which is one way of dissuading amphibious assaults on Odessa, if you can blow up the Black Sea Fleet ships that might be doing it. And also more sophisticated ground to air missiles that help the Ukrainians bring down Russian aircraft. So I think here the UK has been a bit of a role model. Now, I would add, just looking over my shoulder at the Polish flag here, that Poland also has been very important, both as a country that has accepted over 2 million Ukrainian refugees or people formerly with temporary protected status, provided them with generous health and public welfare and other benefits, but also acted as the staging ground not only for its own shipments to Ukraine, but also for transshipment of nearly everybody else's weapons being provided to Ukraine. That is not risk-free. From a business development point of view, if you were to now be trying to invest in Poland's easternmost region, the one right next to the Ukrainian border, most insurers would no longer cover you, thinking of it as a potential retaliation zone for the Russians. But certainly Poland's role has also been very important.
Thank you for that, Roman. Okay, Garth, I think you've got a question.
Thank you. How are the municipalities doing? In 2017 or 2019, while you were ambassador, we met once, and
Yes.
the pledge program was going on. We were partnering cities in Canada with Lviv and Kyiv and Dnipropetrovsk and dozens of others. How are they doing today?
Well, I have to say that our partner cities in Zaporizhia Oblast in the southeast are not doing so well. I think Berdyansk and Melitopol and Enerhodar, 3 of the 4 are currently occupied by the Russians. So, and they've had sort of fake alternate city administrations that have been foisted upon them. On the other hand, in the central and western municipalities have been among the ones that have been themselves been receiving internally displaced people. Because yes, 4 million people have left Ukraine, over 4 million, mostly women and children, but about 6 million people have been internally displaced within Ukraine. And the traditional international organizations, International Organization for Migration, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees have been, even the Red Cross have generally been very slow in reacting. They weren't thinking of having a massive multi-million person crisis in Europe. So it's been largely up to local municipalities and Ukrainian organized volunteer groups to receive people, including also the Ukrainian business community mobilizing to do this. So we've seen a lot of that kind of horizontal grassroots support, providing places to live and providing community kitchens, etc., for hundreds of thousands of people who have moved from east to west in Ukraine.
Gary.
Thank you for your presentation. We know this is an incredibly complex conflict, especially demographically speaking. Many Russians have Ukrainian ancestry and even relatives living in Ukraine. And even Ukraine itself has a complicated demographic profile. There are ethnic Russians and Russian speakers largely in the eastern part of Ukraine. Do you get a sense that those ethnic Russians, people who maybe before would have some kind of allegiance to Russia or sort of look towards Russia, are they turning now? Are they becoming more invested in Ukraine as a state than they were before?
I think I think it's maybe more helpful to think of Ukraine as a political nation, in the sense that even regardless of whether people of their ethnicity or language they speak, their political habits over the last 30 years have become largely similar. So in the same way that, like, people in BC speak English, and so do people in Arizona, but the political culture of BC and Arizona is somewhat different. And if Arizonans were to come and invade and try to impose their political culture, you would assume that people in BC, whether they were of Sikh background or of sort of Anglo-Scottish background or Ukrainian background, whatever, would all be pretty upset with the Arizona National Guard coming in to tell them what to do. And so there is this kind of Ukrainian, you're not the boss of me mentality. Certainly you're seeing it places like Kharkiv. You're seeing it in resistance, but being crushed in Mariupol, which is a very sad case right now. But I think that there was a report, if you Google it up, in The Guardian by Sean Walker, who's a very good reporter for the London-based Guardian, out of a town of about 25,000 called Trostyanets, Sumy Oblast in Ukraine's northeast. It's about 40 kilometers from the Russian border. I visited it a couple of years ago. It sort of would have won a tidy town competition. Had a mayor who's been there for about 20 years. He's a grassroots kind of guy. A lot of empowerment of local communities. Yuri Bova, I think people who were involved in Pledge may have met him at one time or another. I think he visited Canada and FC in Federation of Municipalities. and a population that, yes, liked being Ukrainian, but also felt quite an affinity with people on the other side of the border. You know, it's, after all, only 40 kilometers away. And Sean Walker interviews them after the Russians left, leaving, you know, total devastation behind and dead people in basements and that sort of thing. And just the complete extent to which people hate and despise the Russians now. They just see them as people who wouldn't let them lead their own lives and who came to kill them to be able to force them to live the way the Russians wanted to do it. And Russians not in a linguistic sense, but in a political culture sense. And I think that's what's happened now, is that ironically, by focusing on the Southeast and the Northeast, Putin has delivered the greatest suffering to people who were proportionally the most Russian-speaking in Ukraine. And they are now the people who are the most virulently opposed to him. So I think Putin was caught in this trap of sort of ethno-religious beliefs about identity and didn't pay much attention at all to political culture. And, you know, political culture is, at the moment, the key differentiator between Ukraine and Russia.
Excellent, thanks. We got 5 minutes left. Probably time for at least one more question. Trudy.
You were speaking at the beginning about how your ideas of nuance have sort of been smashed in the last little while. Can you explain that a little bit maybe, and also just talking about, like, why did Ukraine become more democratic, like, and you talked about that a little bit, and Russia not? Like, what went wrong after the Cold War?
Okay, well, first of all, let's go back to the early modern period. This is when Eastern Europe discussions about it become so occasionally tiresome. But frankly, there is a difference in that, and I say this not just because I'm sitting here in Poland now, but in between the 14th and 17th, 18th centuries, Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so it had this kind of chaotic, partly Polish noble, partly Cossack, rebellious Cossack culture. At the same time as you had in Muscovy, which then became Russia, a much more vertical sort of Ivan the Terrible sort of culture, which drew in part on the heritage of the Golden Horde, the Mongol conquerors who were much more influential. So that's the distant sort of archetypal differences. More recently, it's because no one grouping in post-independence Ukraine was so influential that it could dominate all the others. Ukraine has had 2 revolutions in 2004, 2014. In both cases, they were situations where one power group thought it could impose its will on everybody else, and everyone else then coalesced to throw them out. And so Ukraine is sort of unruly, but it also has this kind of internal balancing mechanism where it has a differentiated power base and no one group can dominate everybody else. So that, I think, is sort of the modern equivalent. Now, historians can then argue over how that connects back to the 16th or 17th century or doesn't. But that's basically the difference, is that, and that Ukrainians, when they're surveyed about public values and are asked, where does power come from? And over 50% of Ukrainians will say it comes from the bottom up, from the people, and then it is allocated to people in government. Same questions asked to Russians, they'll say it comes from the ruler. It comes from the president. And then we, in terms of such freedoms as we might have, we get whatever is left over from what the ruler allows to descend down towards us. And in that sense, despite the fact that they lived in different states for the last 250 years, Ukrainian social attitudes and Polish social attitudes are actually far closer to each other than Ukrainian and Russian social attitudes.
Very good. Thank you very much, Roman. It's been an honor to host you here in Prince George. Again, I apologize for the technical issues. It looks like somebody at CIC headquarters started another webinar at the same time, kicked us out. So that's apparently what's happened. What I'll do is I'll stitch this together as a video and post it and send it out to everyone online. So my sincere apologies to those online who aren't currently online. Yes, very appreciative of this. If we can give Roman a round of applause.
Right. Well, you tell those CIC national people they're not the boss of you. Do the Ukrainian horizontal thing.
Agreed. Well, and you're always welcome to Prince George. If ever you find your way up this part of British Columbia, please, happy to host you and give you a tour of the town.
Great. Thank you very much. Look forward to it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Our server